The wind cut sharp across the open field, carrying with it the sting of frost and the stench of judgment. Lanterns flickered in the hands of grim-faced men, their shadows long and twisted against the pale winter moon. At the edge of a shallow pit, a girl knelt in silence, her hands bound in front of her with coarse hemp rope, her face streaked with frozen tears and caked dirt. Her name was Eliza Rainwater, 17, orphaned, and carrying the child of a man she never had the chance to name. Behind her, cloaked in silence and religious fervor, stood the elders of her settlement, faces shrouded not in sorrow, but shame. The preacher, lips pursed tight beneath his beard, recited a psalm meant to purify the wicked. "The Lord sees the sin of the flesh, and to the earth he returns it," he spoke, voice flat and rehearsed. Not a single glance toward the trembling girl. Not a flicker of mercy. Eliza's breath came in short, shallow gasps, her lungs burning with each inhale of icy air. Her knees ached from kneeling, and her stomach cramped with hunger and fear. Snow dusted her shoulders like ash on a dying ember. She had stopped pleading an hour ago when her own brother, Jacob, refused to meet her eyes. She'd called for him. She'd screamed his name. And he'd walked away, flanked by two men who once swore to protect her. The hole had been dug that morning. She saw them do it, heard the shovel strike frozen soil again and again while women whispered behind shuttered windows. It wasn't a real burial, not the kind with coffins and mourners. It was a sentence, a ritual of silence. One meant to erase her from the earth without blood on anyone's hands. Her wrists bled from the rope. Her lips were cracked, her voice gone. They forced her into the pit with the tip of a musket. She tripped, landed hard on her side, her breath knocked from her chest. The sky above looked empty, no stars, no warmth. Just the gaping maw of judgment ready to swallow her. The first handful of dirt hit her shoulder. Cold. Heavy. She didn't scream. Not this time. Not as the second, the third, and then the cascade of shovelfuls began to fall across her chest, her legs, her face. Dirt filled her ears. Her mouth. Panic clawed at her throat. She thrashed, kicked, but the weight grew too fast. Her limbs slowed. Her lungs searched for air. Her body began to quiet. She thought of her mother. The smell of bread baking. The songs she used to sing before nightfall. Her father's calloused hands holding her tiny one steady as she learned to thread a fishing line. Both gone now. Her mother taken by fever, her father hanged after being accused of stealing from a tax collector. They called it justice. She called it theft of the only soul who ever kept their promises. In her final conscious breath, she thought of the child inside her, still and silent, too young to know betrayal. Then, nothing. Silence. Darkness. A strange, rootless kind. And then, a sound. She wasn't sure how long had passed. Her lungs screamed for air, her fingers twitched involuntarily. Through the veil of suffocation, something scraped at the earth above. Not voices. Not prayers. Just scraping. A rhythm. Shovel against dirt. A flash of light. Faint and golden. A lantern. More digging. Closer now. Then hands. Not white. Not soft. Brown and calloused, and strong as river rock. The earth pulled away and a face loomed over her, shadowed, half covered in fur and beads, expression unreadable. He didn't speak. Just reached down and took her wrist gently, almost reverently, and pulled. Her scream came out as a gasp. Her vision blurred. The air burned in her lungs. Snowflakes melted against her cheeks, and for a moment she thought she'd died after all and heaven was cold. But then the stranger's breath hit her cheek, warm, real. He wrapped her in something coarse and thick. Animal skin. He lifted her like a bundle and moved fast, silent through the woods. Trees passed in a blur. Night deepened. Wolves howled in the distance. He didn't speak. He didn't ask. He simply moved, sure-footed through dark paths until they reached a hollow between two ancient oaks. There, a fire crackled low and steady, a bed of pine needles and moss laid beneath a ridge of rock that shielded them from the wind. He placed her down, as though afraid to break her, then sat cross-legged by the fire, sharpening a blade with a bone whetstone. Eliza tried to speak. Her voice cracked like old timber. Nothing came. Her hands trembled as she reached toward the fire. He didn't stop her. Didn't look at her, either. Just continued his quiet work, like rescuing a half-dead girl from her own grave was no more remarkable than catching a trout. Eventually, he handed her a tin cup of hot broth. She held it with both hands, savoring the heat even though her lips were numb. Still, he didn't ask her name. Didn't offer his. She watched him through tear-dulled eyes, his long black hair braided with strips of leather, the edges of tattoos along his collarbone, a necklace of bare claws against his chest. He looked carved from the wilderness itself, like a creature of bark and bone and silence. The fire danced between them. Crackling, steady. A heartbeat in the woods. Eliza studied her savior, unsure whether he was man, myth, or something in between. Her body ached. Her mind whirled. But in the stillness of that hidden cove, she realized something chillingly clear. She had not been saved by kindness or charity. She had been dug up. For a reason she did not yet understand. As sleep dragged her under again, she managed to whisper, not to him, but to the dark sky above. "Why?" No answer came. Only the sound of wind weaving through pines and the soft rasp of a hunter sharpening his blade. The snow had deepened overnight, laying a thick blanket across the forest floor, muffling the world into silence. When Eliza awoke, the fire had been rekindled, and the man who pulled her from the grave was crouched near it, blowing softly into its embers. His back was to her, shoulders broad and motionless except for the steady rise and fall of his breath. The flicker of flame cast gold against his features, still unreadable, still shrouded in mystery. Her body ached. Her throat felt like sandpaper. But she sat up slowly, pulling the deerskin cloak tighter around her shoulders. The pain in her belly had lessened, though it reminded her with every twitch that life still stirred inside her. Life that others had tried to bury. Her limbs trembled as she moved closer to the fire, cautious yet drawn. The man glanced at her briefly, then handed her a strip of dried meat and a waterskin. No words. Just the act. Eliza nodded, barely. She chewed slowly, lips raw and cracked. He watched her, not with suspicion, but with the steady gaze of someone who understood the wilderness better than he did people. There was no judgment in his eyes, only observation, as if measuring whether she would survive. He rose, slung a bough across his back, and gestured for her to follow. His steps were soundless despite the snow, boots wrapped in hide and sinew. Eliza hesitated. Her legs still felt like hollow branches, but she stood. He waited at the edge of the clearing, offering no help, but not leaving her behind either. She followed. They moved through the woods like shadows. Trees creaked in the cold. Icicles hung from branches like knives. A hawk circled overhead. Eliza stumbled often, but never cried out. The silence between them wasn't cruel, it was protective. Sacred. As if words might crack open some fragile shell neither of them was ready to confront. By midday, they reached a frozen stream. The man motioned for her to wait, then knelt at the bank, scanning for tracks. His fingers traced patterns in the snow, tiny prints, a dragline. Rabbit, maybe. Eliza watched him work, mesmerized. There was a grace to his movements, like the forest spoke to him in a language she didn't understand. He unslung a snare from his pack, set it in place, and returned without looking at her. She wanted to ask his name, wanted to thank him, but her voice, though healed, felt foreign in her mouth. So she said nothing. She simply walked beside him, through the pines and toward a ridge where they made camp that evening beneath a tangle of fallen branches. Later that night, as wind howled outside their shelter, Eliza sat near the fire rubbing warmth back into her feet. She caught him watching her, eyes dark and steady. She pointed to herself. "Eliza," she rasped. Her voice surprised even her. He blinked once. Then, with a quiet rumble, tapped his chest. "Tianata." The name lingered between them. A bridge. She whispered it, testing it. He didn't smile, but something softened in his face. Over the following days, she learned the rhythm of his world. He taught by doing. When he crouched low to inspect plants, she mirrored him. When he carved wood, she sat nearby and watched the shavings fall. He showed her how to tie knots, sharpen a blade, recognize the call of a jay that meant danger was near. One night, she cut her palm trying to whittle a point onto a stick. She hissed, dropped the blade. Tyanata appeared instantly, wrapped her hand in moss and bark, bound it gently. When she looked up, she found his face close, the firelight dancing in his eyes. She didn't look away. Still, the silence between them held. They spoke little, but words weren't needed. When she shivered, he threw another log on the fire. When she cried quietly, he carved a wooden bird and left it beside her bedroll. A Cherokee warbler, she thought. Symbol of freedom, her mother once said. She held it to her chest, the first possession that felt wholly hers. Then came the trappers. They appeared at dusk, 3 white men with rifles slung lazily over their shoulders, stomping through the snow as if it owed them passage. Their voices were loud, slurred with liquor and arrogance. Eliza and Tyanata were just a few yards upstream, gathering water when the men stumbled onto their camp. "Now what do we have here?" one sneered, spotting Eliza's discarded cloak. He turned, saw her, and his grin widened. "Well, ain't you a sweet thing, all tucked away in the trees?" Eliza froze. Her blood turned to ice. The man stepped forward, his boot crunching the snow like breaking bones. The others chuckled behind him, drunk on the smell of fear. Then Tyanata stepped between them. No words, no threats, just the quiet shift of his body into something dangerous. The man laughed, raised his rifle. It never left his shoulder. In a blur, Tyanata closed the distance. A fist met a jaw with a sickening crack. The rifle dropped. Another man lunged. Tyanata spun, elbow to throat. The third reached for a knife, but stumbled over his own boots and fled into the trees. The others followed, swearing, faces bloodied, pride shattered. Eliza stared, heart pounding, her breath sharp and fast. Tyanata stood motionless, blood dripping from a cut above his brow. She approached slowly, reached out, wiped it away with trembling fingers. He didn't flinch. Later, as the fire warmed them once more, she broke the silence. "Why did you help me?" Her voice was clearer now. Tyanata stared into the flames. The silence stretched until she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, softly, he said, "They buried you. But you weren't dead." She watched the firelight flicker across his face. "I would have died." He looked at her finally, something fierce and aching behind his eyes. "You chose to live. I only helped you stand." She lay awake long after he slept, watching the wooden bird spin gently in the breeze. For the first time since the soil closed over her, she no longer felt buried. She felt seen. A flicker of life, fragile but burning. In the distance, wolves howled again. But this time, she didn't tremble. The days grew longer, but the cold did not relent. Spring had not yet stirred from its slumber, and the forest held its breath beneath brittle skies. Eliza's hands were no longer soft, they had grown calloused, her fingers rough with bark and stone, her knuckles cracked but steady. Each morning, she woke before the sun, feeding the fire before Tyanata returned from his early hunt. They spoke more now, but always in quiet tones, as if the woods might punish those who dared to raise their voices. He told her about his childhood in fragments, stories woven between tasks. He had been born near the Hiwassee River, the son of a healer and a hunter, and had watched his people driven from their land under threat of fire and steel. When he was 16, he'd buried his sister after she succumbed to measles brought by settlers. After that, he walked alone, carrying the memory of home in silence. Eliza listened, never interrupting. Sometimes she wept quietly, not just for his grief, but for her own, a sorrow they shared but never named. She had stopped fearing the woods. The towering trees that once loomed like sentinels now became companions. She began to track deer, learned to lay traps for grouse and rabbits, and though she stumbled often, her aim grew steadier. Tyanata never praised her aloud, but when she caught her first kill, a snow hare with a clean shot through the eye, he placed a single red feather beside her bowl at supper. She understood what it meant. Honor. Recognition. She held it close. The child inside her grew, subtle but undeniable. She felt it in the tightness of her waistband, the way her breath shortened when climbing steep trails. One morning, she caught Tyanata watching her as she rubbed her belly absently. His gaze lingered, not with judgment, but something more ancient, concern, perhaps, or wonder. He didn't speak. But later, when she returned to camp, she found he had laid a blanket of soft elk fur beside her bedroll. He'd stitched it himself. The edges were clumsy, but it was warm. She clutched it to her chest, tears stinging her eyes. Trouble returned with the thaw. It began with smoke, thin, dark threads rising in the distance. Then came the sound of hooves, distant but unmistakable. Eliza and Tyanata crouched low beneath a rise, eyes trained on the ridgeline as 5 riders passed, rifles gleaming, red sashes flapping in the breeze. They weren't soldiers. Not anymore. The war had ended, but peace hadn't followed. These were scavengers, former Confederates turned mercenaries, preying on weak settlements and traveling camps. Eliza recognized one of them. Sam Gallows. He'd once tried to court her when she was just 15. Her father had run him off with a pitchfork. That same week, someone poisoned their well. Her father was dead 3 months later. Sam had vanished, until now. Tyanata's jaw tightened as he watched the men. "Raiders," he muttered. She nodded. "They'll see the smoke." They packed what they could, dried meat, water, their weapons, and vanished into the trees. For 3 days, they stayed on the move, traveling by night, doubling back to confuse their trail. Eliza's body strained under the effort, her stomach twisting in hunger, her feet blistered. But she didn't complain. She couldn't. Tyanata was carrying more than his share and barely slept. On the 4th morning, they found their camp ransacked. The fire pit had been scattered, traps crushed, bedrolls slashed. Eliza stared at the wreckage, breath catching in her throat. It wasn't just an invasion. It was a message. Tyanata's expression hardened. "They'll come back." She looked around. "Then we fight." His gaze snapped to hers, surprised. For a moment, he looked as if he might protest. But then he nodded slowly. "Then we prepare." They returned to the ridge that night, not to flee, but to fortify. Tyanata showed her how to set snares not for animals, but for men, pitfalls masked with bramble, tripwires strung between trees, sharp branches buried in snow. Eliza built them with shaking hands but steady purpose. She carved stakes, lined her blade with bear fat, prepared herself not just to survive, but to defend. The confrontation came on the 6th night. Snow fell softly as the raiders crept through the trees, unaware they were being watched. Eliza crouched in the crook of an old elm, bow drawn, breath silent. She could see Sam's face through the branches, smirking, arrogant, gun slung low like he had nothing to fear. She waited until he stepped into the wire. It snapped. He fell hard, rifle clattering. Another man screamed as he plunged into a hidden pit. The woods erupted in chaos. Tyanata emerged from the shadows like a ghost, blade flashing. He moved with terrifying precision, striking, vanishing, striking again. Eliza fired. Her arrow lodged in the shoulder of a man aiming at Tyanata's back. The raider screamed, turned toward her, but she was gone, melting into the trees. One of the men caught her near the stream, dragged her by the hair, snarling. Her screams echoed through the dark. She clawed at his face, kicked, but he was stronger. Then the crack of bone. A grunt. Tyanata crashed into him like a bear. They fell together in the snow, grappling, fists flying. Eliza stumbled back, breathless, as the man raised a knife, too fast. But Tyanata was faster. He drove his own blade upward, clean and final. The raiders fled. What few remained disappeared into the woods, leaving blood and boot prints behind. Silence fell, broken only by the wind. Eliza dropped to her knees, hands shaking. The snow around her was stained red. Tyanata stood over the body, panting, his face streaked with blood. She looked up at him, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You came." "I always will," he said quietly. She leaned into him, buried her face against his chest. He held her without hesitation, one arm around her shoulders, the other steadying his blade. That night, they didn't speak. They sat close to the fire, backs pressed together, eyes on the shadows. The danger had passed for now, but the world beyond the trees still hungered, still watched. As dawn broke over the ridge, Eliza stepped forward and looked out over the valley. The snow was beginning to melt. Patches of earth peeked through, and in the distance, a single crocus pushed up through the frost, a promise, however fragile. She turned to Tyanata. I can't go back. Not ever. He nodded. Then we go forward, he said. And together they walked into the thawing wilderness, not as prey, but as something stronger. Two souls once broken, now bound by blood, by silence, and by the earth that refused to bury them. The forest turned green again. Where once bare branches stretched like skeletal fingers into the sky, now leaves unfurled in tender shades of spring. Birds returned, weaving their songs through the canopy, and the air no longer bit with frost but hummed with renewal. Eliza stood at the edge of a wide clearing, barefoot in damp soil, her hand resting gently on the curve of her growing belly. Each kick was a reminder of life stolen, then reclaimed, of breath taken beneath the earth and returned in silence. Tyanata carved quietly beneath a birch nearby, shaping wood into something she could not yet see. He worked like always, slow, deliberate, focused, his expression unreadable, but never cold. When he paused, she stepped beside him, brushing her fingertips across his shoulder. He didn't flinch anymore. Their silence had changed from caution to comfort, from fear to familiarity. They had built a new shelter, larger, stronger, tucked into the shadow of a stone cliff where no trails passed and no smoke would draw eyes. Each log was lifted with effort, every wall sealed with sap and moss. Together, they formed something beyond survival. A home, even if it had no name. At night, she began to dream again, memories from a time before the soil closed around her. Her mother's lullabies, her father's laughter, the sweet sting of apples freshly picked. But the dreams grew darker. The day they came for her returned like thunder, her uncle's hand clenched around her wrist, the churchwomen murmuring shame and judgment, the sound of dirt raining down on her face. She would wake gasping, clawing at the earth in her mind, only to find Tyanata already by her side, a hand steadying her shoulder, a single word whispered in Cherokee, Nwati, life. He never pressed her to speak, but she did anyway. Slowly, pieces falling from her lips like broken pottery. She told him about the preacher who'd called her ruined, about the night they decided she was better off dead, about how her breath had nearly stopped under layers of silence and shame. He listened, not like someone gathering facts, but like someone absorbing pain, holding it in his bones so she didn't have to bear it alone. Shame, she whispered one night, curled by the fire. That's what they called it. What I was. Tyanata looked up from the bowl he was carving, eyes dark and unwavering. Shame belongs to those who bury the living, he said, not to those who rise. The child grew restless as summer deepened. Her stomach stretched, her back ached, and some days the forest felt too vast, too wild for something as fragile as birth. Yet she trusted it more than she trusted the world that had cast her out. When the pains began, they came like distant drums, soft at first, then insistent, shaking her to the core. Tyanata built a bed of moss and bark inside the shelter, darkened the fire, brought water from the stream. He spoke softly, sometimes singing under his breath in a language that flowed like wind through pine needles. Eliza clenched her teeth, riding each wave of agony with breath and grit, gripping his hand so hard her knuckles bled. Hours passed. Then more. She screamed once, sharp, raw, primal. And then the world went silent except for the soft, sudden cry of new life. A boy, tiny and red, fists curled, lungs fierce. Tyanata cut the cord with his knife, wrapped the child in fur, and handed him to her with both hands. Not as a warrior offering tribute, but as a man giving the world back to someone who had once lost it. Eliza stared at the child, her heart breaking and mending in the same beat. He blinked at her, mouth opening in a silent search. She cradled him close, tears falling freely. "I never thought I'd see him," she whispered. "Never thought I'd breathe long enough." Tyanata knelt beside her. "You did more than breathe," he said. "You rose." They named him Salanvii, Sky Child. As autumn crept back in, whispers of danger returned. The world beyond the trees was stirring again. Travelers passed on the far edge of the valley, strangers seeking land, families rebuilding after war. Some carried goodness. Others carried fire. One afternoon, Tyanata returned from a distant ridge with eyes heavy. "They're building a town," he said, "just west of the river." Eliza's chest tightened. "How long until they find us?" "Not long." That night, they sat together under the stars, Salanvii asleep between them. The fire crackled low. Eliza ran her fingers through her son's hair, her thoughts a whirlwind of fear and resolve. "We could run," she said. Tyanata shook his head. "We've run long enough." She looked at him. "Then what?" He turned toward her fully. "We show them we're not ghosts. Not things to be hunted or buried. We are here. And we stay." The words struck something deep. Not pride. Not vengeance. But truth. They had lived in silence long enough. Hidden. Afraid. But this land was theirs too, not by blood or deed, but by right of survival. Days later, Eliza wrapped Salanvii against her chest and walked with Tyanata to the edge of the forest, where grassland stretched wide beneath a fading sun. The wind carried voices from the town beyond, hammers, laughter, the distant cries of children. She stood tall, shoulders squared. They would not return to the world unchanged. They would return as witnesses, of cruelty, of resilience, of rebirth. She had been buried for shame. But now she walked as a mother, as a survivor, as something more than they had dared imagine. And somewhere, beneath the soil she had clawed her way from, the earth remembered her breath. The forest remembered her name. And the child in her arms would grow up never knowing silence as punishment, but as peace. Her voice broke softly across the wind. "Let them see us." And beside her, Tyanata nodded. Not just protector. Not just hunter. But family. The story had not ended in a grave. It had only begun there. Call to action. If Eliza's journey moved you, if her strength, her survival, and her rise from the earth spoke to something inside you, please like this video, leave a comment about what part touched your heart, and subscribe for more true stories of resilience and redemption. Every voice matters. Yours too.